Right now, somewhere on your body, there's a seam touching your skin. You didn't think about it. You never do. But rewind the clock far enough, and that seam is one of the strangest inventions your species ever produced. Picture an early human standing on the open grassland, roughly 200,000 years ago. Sun overhead, wind picking up dust, nothing on their body except skin. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Almost no other large mammal on the planet lives that way. Look at a lion, fully coated, a horse, coated. An elephant, lumbering through completely different terrain, still comes with built-in insulation. Then there's you, evolutionarily speaking. Smooth, patchy in places, looking like someone who used to own a coat and quietly let the subscription lapse. Why did that happen? The leading explanation has to do with heat, not cold. As your ancestors shifted from forest life to long-distance hunting on open plains, thick body hair turned from an asset into a liability. Running for hours chasing prey generates enormous internal heat. Fur traps that heat against the skin instead of releasing it. An overheating hunter doesn't catch dinner. An overheating hunter collapses, and collapsing on a hot savanna with predators nearby is not a survivable mistake to make twice. So evolution did something almost architectural. It didn't just remove the fur, it replaced the entire cooling system. Modern humans carry somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands, an almost absurd number when you compare it to other primates. You are biologically one of the most efficient heat-dumping mammals that has ever existed. If sweating were a competitive sport, your species would own the podium. That system works beautifully in the heat. It becomes a serious liability the moment the temperature drops. A body built to shed heat efficiently is a body that struggles badly once the environment turns cold, and early humans eventually pushed into environments that were very, very cold. Here's where the obvious explanation starts to wobble. The tidy version of the story says humans got cold, so they invented clothing, simple as that. A straight line from problem to solution. Except when scientists started digging into the actual timeline of when clothing appeared, the numbers refused to line up with that story. The evidence suggested clothing existed tens of thousands of years before humans ever migrated into the cold regions where you'd expect it to matter. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If people were already wearing something before they needed it for warmth, what were they actually using it for? And how would anyone even figure out a timeline that old, when hide and plant fiber rot away almost completely within a few centuries, let alone 100 millennia? The answer to that second question is bizarre enough that it's almost easier to believe as fiction. It comes from something you'd normally want nowhere near your body. It comes from lice. Scientists studying human parasites noticed something odd. Humans host two genetically distinct populations of lice. One lives in the hair on your head, the other lives exclusively in fabric, tucked into seams and folds where it can hide and feed. And critically, that second population cannot survive on bare skin. It needs woven material or hide to exist at all. At some point in the deep past, these two lice populations split apart genetically. Head lice stayed head lice. A separate branch evolved specifically to exploit clothing as a habitat. That split could only have happened once actual garments existed in the world for lice to colonize. No clothing, no ecological niche, no divergence. It's almost elegant in a repulsive sort of way. A parasite quietly filed the paperwork on when humans invented fashion, and nobody bothered to check the records for over 100,000 years. When researchers ran the genetic clock backward to estimate when this lice split occurred, they landed on a window somewhere between roughly 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Sit with the wide end of that range for a second. That's close to 200,000 years before your grandparents were born, and it points to humans deliberately wearing something long before anyone had reason to expect it. Now compare that number to when humans actually started leaving Africa in meaningful numbers, which most evidence places around 70,000 years ago. Do the subtraction. Clothing appears to predate the migration into colder climates by tens of thousands of years. If the only reason humans invented clothing was to survive cold weather, that timeline makes no sense. You'd expect clothes to show up right around the time people started encountering snow, not tens of millennia earlier while everyone was still living somewhere warm. So something else was going on. Something that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the kind of animal humans actually are. If warmth wasn't the original driver, two other explanations fit the timeline far better. The first is straightforward: basic physical protection. Early humans spent their days moving through thorny scrub, tracking animals across rocky, sun-scorched terrain. A simple wrap of hide around the waist or shoulders isn't glamorous, but it creates a barrier against thorns, biting insects, and sunburn, and it likely cut down on minor infections from small cuts. Not a dramatic theory, probably still partly true. The second explanation is where things get genuinely strange, and it has everything to do with what kind of creature you are underneath all the biology. Humans are relentlessly social, not casually social, obsessively social. Your ancestors were constantly signaling status, group membership, availability, and threat level to everyone around them, using posture, facial expression, voice, and eventually, what they put on their bodies. There's a site in South Africa called Blombos Cave where archaeologists found something remarkable. A small toolkit for deliberately processing ochre pigment, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. This wasn't someone accidentally smearing themselves with colored dirt. It was a workshop. Grinding stones, mixing containers, a repeatable process for producing pigment on purpose. That's not incidental behavior, that's intention. Someone had decided that how they looked to others mattered enough to build tools around it, and that impulse appears to predate the earliest confirmed clothing, which suggests the desire to decorate the body, to visually broadcast something about yourself to the group, may be older than clothing itself. Painting the skin came first. Wrapping it in a particular hide, worn a particular way, was a short cognitive step from there. Once you're already asking, what does this pigment say about me? Asking, what does this leopard skin say about me, isn't much of a leap. And this wasn't unique to your branch of the human family tree. Neanderthals were processing hides with specialized stone tools well before they ever crossed paths with modern humans, and their stockier, cold-adapted bodies suggest they needed functional clothing for serious, sustained cold. In the same Siberian cave layers where the earliest sewing needle was found, researchers also uncovered pierced, polished ornaments left by Denisovans, a human lineage so obscure it was only identified in 2010 from a single finger bone. A species we barely have evidence for was still finding time to think about decoration. Multiple separate branches of the human family, isolated from each other by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently arrived at the same idea: dress the body and make that choice mean something. That's either evidence of a deep evolutionary drive towards symbolic communication, or proof that any sufficiently intelligent, socially wired primate eventually lands on the same answer, whether or not the two groups ever compare notes. Here's the part that should feel uncomfortably familiar. In 2012, researchers ran an experiment now known in psychology as enclothed cognition. Participants wore a plain white lab coat and performed a series of attention tasks. Nothing else changed. Same room, same test, same person. Except some were told the coat belonged to a doctor. Others were told it was simply a painter's coat. The people who believed they were wearing a doctor's coat performed measurably better on tasks requiring sustained attention. Same fabric, same body, different meaning attached to it, and their brain responded to the meaning, not the material. That's not a modern quirk. That's the same wiring your ochre-painted ancestor had 100,000 years ago, standing by a fire, deciding what a particular hide said about who they were. You still run that program every single morning without noticing it. Then the climate turned hostile, and clothing stopped being a choice about identity, and became the difference between a bloodline continuing or ending entirely. Somewhere between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth cycled through a series of brutal glacial periods. Temperatures dropped sharply. Ice sheets expanded. Large stretches of Africa turned hyper-arid. Lakes vanished, and food sources collapsed along with them. Some estimates suggest the entire human population crashed to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 individuals. Your species came close enough to extinction that the outcome genuinely could have gone the other way. For the groups that survived, and especially the ones who eventually pushed north into brutally cold territory, clothing stopped being optional decoration and became load-bearing survival infrastructure. And around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows exactly how seriously that infrastructure was being engineered. In Denisova Cave in Siberia, researchers found a bone needle with a properly bored eye, fine enough to thread sinew through and stitch fitted seams, rather than just drape hide over the shoulders. Someone looked at a hollow bird bone, imagined a tool that didn't exist yet, and carved it into existence. That's not instinct, that's design thinking, applied to staying alive. You can see how far that engineering eventually went by looking at Ötzi, a man whose frozen body was discovered in the Alps, dead for roughly 5,300 years. He wasn't wearing a single crude wrap. He had layered garments built for specific jobs: a coat, leggings, a belt, shoes stuffed with grass for insulation, each piece constructed from different materials chosen for different properties. That's not a person who threw something on. That's a person wearing an engineered system, refined over tens of thousands of years of trial, error, and inherited knowledge passed down through generations who didn't survive without it. Eventually, hide gave way to something even more versatile. In a cave in the country of Georgia, archaeologists found twisted plant fiber dating back roughly 30,000 years, and it was already dyed in multiple colors. Function and meaning tangled together from the very beginning. By the time agriculture emerged around 10,000 BCE, humans were cultivating flax and domesticating sheep for wool, and clothing had become a full economic and cultural system. Entire trade routes formed around it. Empires financed themselves through it. Silk alone reshaped political power across half the ancient world. So why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? Not for one reason, but for several, stacked on top of each other across tens of thousands of years. Protection first, probably. Then a way to say something about who you were to the people around the fire. Then, when the climate turned against you, the thin margin between living and dying. And eventually an entire language written in fabric and dye. Which brings it back to you this morning, pulling something over your head without a second thought. You made choices, even small unconscious ones, about what to put on your body today. And those choices say something about who you are and where you belong. Exactly the way ochre-stained hide said something about a person standing at a fire 100,000 years ago. Nothing about that impulse has gone anywhere. You just call it getting dressed instead of survival.